A teenage boy soldier from Normal survived one of the most brutal prison camps in history. Decades after the Civil War, Alpheus Pike wrote a memoir that serves as this episode of our series, McHistory. Pike details horrific sanitary conditions, the murderous behavior of guards and prisoners alike, and amid the privation, the grace notes of human caring that emerge from these trials.
When arriving at the stockade, the gates were open and we marched up in line along the edge of the swamp. The guards and rebel sergeant leaving after remarking, "You will all stay here."
Alpheus Pike was born in the state of Maine in 1846, and he'll come to Bloomington as a young boy. And he will be then attending a school in Normal when the Civil War breaks out, and he will enlist at the age of 15 in the 39th Illinois Volunteer Infantry.
I'm Zach Dietmeyer, and I'm a board member for the McLean County Museum of History.
This is Bill Kemp, librarian with the McLean County Museum of History.
Some of our men stood in line thinking the sergeant would return and mark out a camping ground for us. He did not return, and they might have been standing yet if it hadn't been for the information received from an old prisoner who said, "What are you waiting here for? You will stand here a damn long time if you wait for him to come back."
He'll campaign in the Eastern Theater. He will be captured. This is in May of 1864 at the Battle of Drury's Bluff.
This broke the spell, and each one in his own mind realized, truly, the horrible position that we were in. Being in the center of the Southern Confederacy, enclosed in a stockade, without blankets, without shelter, without much food, exposed to the rain and sun, and there for a time indefinite.
And he will be sent to the notorious, infamous Confederate prison camp of Andersonville, which is located about 120 miles south of Atlanta, deep within the heart of the Confederacy, making escape all but impossible.
In several things, I was most fortunate, and in two things in particular. I had been in the field for 2 years and 9 months, and therefore was well toughened to stand the hardships of prison life. Secondly, I met my brother.
His brother Ivory, who was in the 16th Illinois Cavalry, was captured 5 months earlier. And that's very fortunate for young Alpheus because his brother, who's a little bit older, who's an expert barter and trade man, will be able to help his brother stay alive in the ensuing months.
The dead in camp were picked up and carried out in blankets, and those who carried a dead man would sometimes have a chance to pick up a scrap of wood here and there, which was very valuable, and therefore it was quite a treat to have that privilege.
Almost 13,000 Union prisoners will die at Camp Sumter. We know that as Andersonville. At one time, there'll be 32,000 prisoners at Andersonville.
Each morning, 3 or 4 large government wagons, each driven by 6 mules, would drive up to the dead house, loading on its ghastly load, uncoffined, simply bearing a tag pinned to the breast, thrown onto the wagon as carelessly as wood, only not in as good order, crosswise, lengthwise, arms sticking over when well piled up.
The prison itself was only about 26.5 acres, so that's about 1,200 men per acre. It was said to be, at its height, the Confederacy's 5th largest city.
Many died of homesickness, especially new recruits and married men. It was also proverbial in camp if a man was married, he would be carried out a corpse, he probably having given greater grief on account of home and friends. I have known great hardy men to come in there and be carried out in 10 days, there seeming no disease.
30,000 Union troops will die in Confederate prisoner of war camps, but Northerners must not shake their collective finger at the South because no less than 26,000 Confederates will die in Northern camps. And in the state of Illinois, there were prisoner of war camps in Chicago, Rock Island, and in Alton.
The soldiers were terribly pestered with vermin.
There were gangs preying on the weak and the helpless. These gangs took names such as 40 Thieves and, most famously, Mosby's Guerrillas. Alpheus Pike recalls in this memoir, quote, "In most flocks you will find some black sheep, and in this flock there were a great many black ones."
I used to do what we called lousing regularly, twice a day, taking off all my clothes and searching through and through, hardly ever missing finding from 15 to 20. Had all the prisoners taken the precaution, we certainly would not have been troubled with them. A great many were too disheartened and too discouraged, and many were too sick and could not. You could actually, at times, see them crawling on the ground. One day on the ground near the creek, some of the prisoners, of a human nature, had got a man whom they had found unable to fight the vermin, and who was really being eaten to death. He was sitting on the ground with no clothing on. They had removed them and burned them. His hair, which was somewhat long and shaggy, was so filled with lice, it looked as though you had taken a handful of coarse cornmeal and thrown it into his hair from a distance of a few feet. These humanitarians scrubbed him with soap and water, shaved his head, and got a few other garments, such as they could, and let him go again.
Two things were the greatest killer. One was a lack of clean water. So they had to drink foul water, hence the spread of dysentery. The second greatest killer was maybe scurvy, right? That's a lack of vitamin C. Awful, horrible ways to die.
The meat consisted very rarely of fresh meat, most always ham or bacon. The latter was sometimes fair, but most times so strong it was yellow, and I can say a little of it would go a long way. The hams were never sound, but were from tainted to rotten, and these hams had most certainly been condemned as being unfit for their own soldiers.
Alpheus Pike blames Abraham Lincoln for what he believed was all this needless suffering. Lincoln had halted prisoner exchanges because the Confederacy declared that if black troops would be captured, the Confederacy promised to place those soldiers into slavery and then to execute their white officers. Pike is eventually freed, and he's mustered out of a Union Army service in 1865. And as he recalls in this memoir, that he spent 3 years, 5 months, and 15 days as a Union infantryman.
While I have spoken of the degeneracy of the camp, generally there seemed to be some where the spark of humanity would not die out. These were the Good Samaritans that healed the wounds of body as well as of soul.
After the war, Alpheus Pike worked as a conductor on the Chicago and Alton Railroad, the lumber business in Chenoa, and for 15 years as a candy maker. He died in 1892 and is buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Bloomington. McHistory is a co-production of WGLT and the McLean County Museum of History. You heard Bill Kemp and Zach Dietmeyer of the museum. WGLT's Charlie Schlenker produced this episode.